Hey, they said that recording in progress. Said recording in progress.
Oh, they're starting it? Oh, you did live? Okay, so, I'll make the announcement. We can start when we'll hear it.
Yeah.
Testing. Okay, it is 6:30, so I'm going to ask our audience to take their seats and welcome the audience online. So, good evening. Welcome to Wildfire, a century of failed forest policy with George Wuerthner. Tonight's event is the 10th in our series, Under One Canopy, celebrating trees and forests, culminating in our annual Earth Day Festival, which is tomorrow at the fairgrounds. If you'd like to watch any of the previous talks, we've recorded almost all of them, and they are available on our website at gallatinvalleyearthday.org. I'm thrilled to see all of you here in the audience tonight, and I also welcome all of you that are joining us online tonight. My name is Ann Reddy, and I am the chair of the Gallatin Valley Earth Day Committee. I'm really looking forward to George's talk to learn more about how fire management over the last century has failed us. But first, I just want to take a few moments to thank some of the sponsors and underwriters of this event. Our whole series is free only because of the support, the generous support from businesses and government organizations and nonprofits in our community. And see. Here we go. I'd really like to thank Greater Gallatin United Way, who is our fiscal sponsor, collecting all of our money and paying our bills for us. And then also our premier sponsors, the City of Bozeman, Volkswagen of Bozeman, and Audi Bozeman. And of course, our benefactor sponsors. There we go. Sacagawea Audubon Society, Gallatin Wildlife Association, our local radio station, KGVM, Bozeman Greenbuild, and Montana Parents Magazine. And then our stewards, which include Bridger Bowl Ski Area, Happy Trash Can, Republic Services, and Steel. Hold on. And last but not least, I really wanted to thank the underwriters for tonight's event, which is the Gallatin Wildlife Association and the Gallatin Yellowstone Wilderness Alliance. Without their generous support, we wouldn't have been able to present this presentation tonight free for you all. So as I mentioned, the Gallatin Wildlife Association is helping bring this event to you tonight. And I wanted to bring Clint Nagel from that organization up to the stage. But before I do that, I just want to give you a heads up that after George gets done talking, we will have a relatively short question and answer period. So if you're joining us online, I want you to look on your screen, and at the bottom of the screen, it says Q&A. So just click on that and a little box will pop up. Type in your question there, and then one of our tech people will read the question to George here so he can answer it. If you're in the audience, just raise your hand because I will have a microphone, and I need the microphone so that I can take it to you so that our online audience can hear your question. Okay, well, as I say, without further ado, I'd like to introduce or welcome Clint Nagel to the stage, and he'll take it from here. Thank you, Clint.
Thank you, and thank you, and welcome for attending. It's glad to see everybody come out on a cool April evening. My name is Clint Nagel. I'm the president of the Gallatin Wildlife Association, and it is a privilege to introduce George Wuertner tonight. It's always right and good to introduce someone that has the passion to make the world a better place. And that's how I see George and all of his efforts. And so it's, I'm guarantee that you will learn something tonight from his presentation. Before I introduce George, however, there are a few things I would like to say about GWA and the subject matter at hand. GWA has been a wildlife advocacy organization since 1976. It's a nonprofit, and we have worked toward protecting wildlife and their habitat. And of course, along with that, that means that we also fight for protection of our forest and grasslands. And we also argue for basically trying to fight climate change. And all those three things, our biodiversity, our climate, our forests, they're inextricably related. And about 2017 was the first time I met George, and it was at a GWA held a forest forum at the Emerson Theater. And there he was talking about fire and forest management. And that was my first introduction to the knowledge that George has. And along with that, in our continuous work to protect the forest, trying to get the best available science for forest management, GWA has joined a national coalition called the Climate Forest Coalition, CFC. And it is a coalition of about 120 to 130 grassroots organizations across the country, coast to coast. And it is chock full of people with reputable experience in fighting climate change and trying to discover the relationship between forest and our climate. And I mention that for a reason. Just recently, the plan is basically from the Forest Service to develop a national, get this right here, basically a national coalition to protect old growth forest. And there's an old forest growth amendment proposed by the U.S. Forest Service that will be, the draft environmental impact statement will be coming out in May. And it's going to be a 90-day comment period from about June to August. And I ask that you all stay tuned to GWA for information on that. Basically, we're trying to protect national old growth forests across the nation. And we never had a national old growth forest policy before. So this is definitely a step in the right direction. And again, I ask you to watch, stay tuned to GWA for further information on that, because there's going to be some petitions and there's going to be some information to come out. We don't know yet, obviously, what the DEIS will look like. We don't know what the alternatives will look like, but we have right now a chance to hopefully massage that procedure to get some good science in one of the alternatives. So that's what I will be spending my time on in the next several months. And that brings us to tonight's talk. Like I said, I've known George for about 7 years. And I will say that he is a fighter when it comes to trying to protect our natural world. And I ask you to listen to his presentation and just listen to the passion in his voice. Hopefully he will instill that passion in all of us to go out and do what we can to protect our old growth forest and to have a better fire management policy across our country. George Wuerther's bio is long and lengthy. I could not provide all of it tonight without rambling on, and you don't want to hear me, you want to hear him. But he is an ecologist, a freelance writer, a photographer. He has been a natural history guide in Yellowstone National Park. He's been a high school teacher, and more recently he's been involved in ecological project director for the foundation for the deep ecology. He currently is also the executive director for the Public Lands Media, a nonprofit organization that he can continue to do his research, photography, and his writings. He has published 38 books on various topics related to environmental and natural history. Among the titles are Welfare Ranching, the subsidized destruction of the American West; Wildfire, a century of failed forest policy, which is tonight's presentation. And he's did a book on Yellowstone and the fires of change. So you can see that George doesn't necessarily run away from controversial issues. And he has worked with Doug Tompkins and spent a number of years gathering photos and information for the wildfire for a century of failed forest policy. I should say that he has either been or is still a board member of several science advisory, in the capacity of a board member or science advisory board member of several environmental organizations. The only one that I will mention tonight is ours. He is, I'm proud to say that he is our science advisory board member. And with that, I will give you George Wuertner. Be prepared to learn and be educated. Thank you.
So can you hear me okay? I've got a headset on I've never used before. Okay. So we have a little tech thing here going. And I'm going to tell a little bit of story. I think it's kind of interesting. Kind of the theme I'm going to cover tonight is how things that people think are bad maybe are gifts. And so I'm going to just give you a little bit of my own life story. When I was a youngster, I was terrible at reading. I only learned when I got to be an adult, and it turned out my kids had the same problem, which is their dyslexia. And I took a long time to learn how to read, but I just like to read. My parents got me these golden book encyclopedias, you know, and one night I'd read about the Crusades, another night about castles. I was just kind of interested in all kinds of things. And eventually I learned how to read and, you know, got off to college, and I went to the University of Montana, where mostly I took courses in ecology. We're having another techo thing here. I took everything that had the name ecology in it. You know, so animal ecology, forest ecology, range ecology, terrestrial land ecology, going on and on and on, population ecology, et cetera. So I was always interested in that. But I also took a couple of journalism classes, and the professor had a policy: if you misspelled a word, you flunked the assignment. And you know, and he got really frustrated with me because it seemed like very simple words. I remember one was rifle, and I couldn't spell it, you know, and he says, why don't you use a dictionary? And it was like, well, it doesn't look wrong to me. And so it's hard to use a dictionary. You know, the other day, this is an example, I was trying to spell the word sovereign, and I kind of knew it started with S-O something. And I spelled it like 4 times, you know, and my Google spell check had no idea what I was trying to spell. That's how far off I was. And so I always have a problem with that. And yet I wound up, you know, writing these books. And that's kind of a funny story too. I went to UC Santa Cruz for graduate school in a thing called science communication. And I had the same problem there too. But I found out, and this is the gift stuff, I found out being dyslexic turned out to be a good thing for me, because all these other people that were in the program were perfectionists, and I am anything but a perfectionist. And so I could write, you know, pages of stuff in the time it taken to write 1 paragraph, because they'd worry about every word and so forth. And I just didn't worry about that. And that became a very good trait to have if you're going to be a freelance writer trying to make a living selling articles and books. And so that is one of the things that I try to talk about, is that some of the stuff I'm going to tell you about fires, where you'll think that something is bad, but it may actually turn out to be a good thing. And one of the lucky things that happened to me as a result of doing these books is I did a book on contract for Doug Tompkins, which was mentioned. He used to own North Face and then a Spree, and he took his money and started buying national park lands, buying land and making them into national parks down in Chile and Argentina. And so Doug contacted me, and this is I had taken a job as a high school teacher because at that point I needed health insurance for my family, and I needed a job with health insurance. So anyway, Doug writes me, he says, well, I'd like you to do some work on contract. And I said, well, Doug, I just can't, I've got to have medical insurance and stuff. So he said, well, let me think about this. And he writes me back about a month later and he says, well, I'd like to hire you at the foundation. And here's what your job is. You are to research and write books. 2, take pictures to illustrate the books. 3, give talks about the books. And the 4th thing, and I have this memorized verbatim, is you are to periodically visit North American wildlands to assess the general condition of the landscape. And you can live any place you want. You take time off whenever you want. Once a month, send me a letter and tell me what you're doing. And so, of course, I said, well, I have to think about it. No, I said that, but see, the point is all these things lead to something else that you could never predict. And so that's kind of the theme I want to go over tonight here with my talk. Let's see if I get the next picture. Oh, one more thing. The cover of this book is taken on the East Fork of the Bitter River here in Montana. And it was done by a BLM firefighter. And if you go to this, there's a bridge across the East Fork right near Sula. And you can look right up at the forest there at that place where you can see the trees are all burnt. You'd be amazed. It doesn't hardly look like it even burned today. So it's just one of those examples of things. Okay, so I always start out just kind of giving you a quick overview. So if you don't stay any longer than the next 5 minutes, you kind of know what I was going to talk about. So the first thing is large wildfires are driven by climate and weather, not fuels. And this is contrary to everything you hear from forest agencies and the BLM and so forth. And fire suppression has had little influence on wildfires. And this is the theme that you hear all the time, because then it justifies certain activities like thinning forests and logging. Fuel treatments, that's another euphemism for logging, and prescribed burning under severe wildfire weather conditions are ineffective. And this is a really important point. They may work under less than severe fire conditions, but as I'm going to point out later in the talk, the only fires that matter are the ones burning under severe fire conditions, because they're the ones that are any substantial size. So the very fires that they're supposedly doing this to prevent and control are not controllable. Active forest management is not benign. So this is a picture up on Kurt Hill here in Bozeman. And you can see you got a road there, dirt piled up, good place for weeds to get in, sedimentation and so forth. These are a lot of the problems. And as I'll talk about later, I'll mention it now, most fires occur near roads. So the more roads we put in, the more likely we are to have fires from humans. Okay, now it's not going. Let's see. What am I doing wrong? Pushing the button. Maybe I got to go this button. No? Okay, tech person. Okay, so a few more. High severity wildfires create a unique type of habitat, the snag forest. And the snag forests don't last very long. They're a habitat that a lot of species use. In fact, some people say the second highest biodiversity is found in these fires, fire-created forests, snag forests. And our forests are not unhealthy. That's another thing you'll hear, and I'll give you reasons for that. And the last thing is protect homes and communities through home hardening, things like non-flammable roof, etc., and clear vegetation 100 feet from the home. And of course, the other thing that helps is, and I'll talk about this, don't build in the wildlands urban interface in the first place. Sprawl is adding a lot to our problems. So I have a couple of definitions: high severity, mixed severity, and low severity fires. So basically a high severity fire is, I guess you can't see this out on the screen at home, but see where all the trees are basically all dead. That's a high severity fire. And then you get a place where there's kind of a mixture, and that would be called mixed severity. Makes a lot of sense. And low severity would be a place like this where hardly anything has been killed. And what you have depends a lot on where you draw a line around too. So where the boundaries of the fire, how much of it's high severity or low severity or whatever will vary. Anyway, so you'll hear me use those terms. Now, one of the confusing things that has contributed, when I told you I was at the University of Montana, I took all these classes in ecology, and I had one botany professor, Jim Habeck. I think he's still alive. Anyway, Jim had gotten his PhD studying fire. So any class you took from Jim Habeck, didn't matter what the name was, you got a lot about fire ecology in it. And back then, it was a really big deal to be saying that not all fires were bad. That was the whole mantra had been all fires are bad, we got to stop them all. And that started getting questioned by researchers in the Southwest. And they came up with this Southwest ponderosa pine model. And if you don't know what a ponderosa pine is, they're actually not very common in Montana, but you see a lot of them in places like New Mexico and Arizona, Western Montana, the Bitterroot Valley, and up in the Flatheads ponderosa pine, so does it around Helena, and down the Yellowstone River towards Billings. But nevertheless, it's not that common. That model was that fires were low severity. In other words, they don't kill the trees, and it produced park-like stands. The trouble with that is it's a industrial forestry thinking. In other words, the industrial foresters like the idea that we're going to not have trees get killed. And what you find, industrial forestry thinks that the only thing that is good is when you kill trees with chainsaws, because everything else they want to prevent. Pine beetles, wildfire, drought. We can't let trees die from any of those things. We've got to use chainsaws. And by the way, it doesn't even apply to all ponderosa pine forests too, but that has been widespread. So we made steps with that, but then we're still stuck in this whole idea that low severity fires are the norm. And there's been a whole lot of research questioning this stuff. And by the way, talking about the research, I always look at who did the research. Are they associated with a forestry school, for example? And it doesn't mean all the professors at forestry schools are bad or anything. There's some really good ones. But like Oregon State University gets 25% of its funding from the timber industry. And if you don't think that doesn't influence the kind of questions you ask and the kind of research you do, you're being naive. So I look to see who's done the research, and I find that geography departments, geology departments, botany departments, they tend to take a different view a lot of times than the forestry schools. Anyway, the traditional reference conditions of low severity fire regimes are inaccurate for most forests of Western United States. Mixed severity fires that include significant amounts of weather-driven high severity fire are common. So this is contrary to what you might have heard. I like this quote from Robertson Jeffers. What but the wolf's tooth whittled so fine the fleet limbs of the antelope. And the basic idea is that without wolves, antelope would have no reason to be fast, okay? And eliminates the ones that are slow guys in the crowd. Well, wildfire is like the wolf's tooth that creates beauty and healthy forest ecosystems. And this is a shift in I'm trying to get you to think about. When I did that whole book on wildfire, I have all these beautiful pictures of landscapes with flowers and beautiful forests. And the whole idea was to say, if you like the way this landscape looks and you like its beauty, it's because of wildfire. And you have to appreciate that. So wildfire is a critical for healthy forest ecosystem. That's different than trees. Ecosystem is different than the trees. A healthy forest has a lot of dead trees, snags, and down wood. And when we try to preclude things like insects and wildfire, drought, and other mortality to make healthy forests, we're thwarting evolution. So we need those factors to help select which trees are best adapted to current and future conditions. Oh, that one. No, okay. I don't know if I'm going forward or backwards here. We'll find out. Why several factors are listed as responsible for large wildfires, including fire suppression, lack of Indian burning, and so forth. The driving force for all wildfires today is climate warming due to carbon emissions. And recent climate models attribute fire to increased summer heat and vapor pressure deficit. That's the amount of deficit is what would the air normally hold at maximum moisture, and what has it got now? And so things are getting drier, so that dries up whole trees. During the 1988 fires down in Yellowstone, the internal moisture of the trees there was 1 to 2%. And kiln dried lumber is like 12 to 15%. Uh-oh. I gotta turn that off. Okay. And then we did this one, and I don't know where I'm going. Okay, here we go. High severity blazes enhance biodiversity. Biodiversity is second highest in severe burns. That's probably the opposite of you've ever heard. And And I think it's important to keep that in mind. By the way, this is a picture up Bridger Canyon here, fire that happened a couple of years ago. But so severe stand replacement fires are critical to a lot of species. And in fact, forests don't recover from fire. Many species are recovering from green forests. Let's flip that. That's not the way you think about it, right? But if you're a woodpecker, you want the snag forest. If you're 40% of the mushrooms in Montana grow on dead trees after wildfires and on the logs and stuff. And I'll give you some other things. I'm trying to go from here. For example, 45% of all birds in the West depend on dead trees and down wood. So if you're one of these birds, bluebirds is one example, or bald eagle that nests in a snag, if you eliminated all snags and dead trees, these guys would be out of luck. Bats will roost in the flaky wood underneath a tree bark that's loose. So many bat species depend on that for their homes. The highest bee diversity and density is in high severity fire areas because there's a lot of flowers come in and so forth. And you also have a greater diversity of small mammals. Fish habitat. 50% of the habitat in small to medium-sized streams is from fallen logs. More logs equals more fish. And also they found in Idaho, they did some studies and found there was also more birds and bats because there's a lot more insects that are in streams that have logs. And so that feeds the bats and the birds too. So, where did the logs come from? They come from things like big fire events. And by the way, that kind of episodic input is really critical in the sense that you may only have a big fire once every 100 or 200 years, and that may be the sole source of all the logs that are in that stream for the next couple hundred years, basically. And so that's why you need these episodic events. Then you have the industrial forestry paradigm of thinning, logging, salvage that creates a sanitized, simplified forest with few dead snags. And this is a certified sustainable forestry site in Northern California I went to. And, they were going on and on how great this was because they still had some trees left, it wasn't a clear cut. But if you looked at it, look at the ground. There's no dead logs on it. There's no snags in this forest. And they're not going to allow them to happen in the future either. So this is an economic subjective thing about sustainability. Logs continuously for the mill, but that's not necessarily a sustainable forest ecosystem. Now, the majority of fire histories depend on what are called fire scar studies, where they, as you see in this picture, they cut a section of a tree that they've identified that has scars in it, and then they count the years by the rings on the tree between the fires, and then they come up with a history of what the typical forest fire regime was like. There's a couple of problems with that. One, usually they're not random selection of trees. I used to help that one forest botany professor go out, and we walk around, look for scarred trees. That's kind of like going into a brewery here in Bozeman and saying, everybody raise their hand that likes beer, and then say, well, 100% of the people, well, maybe it wouldn't be 100%, but whatever it would be, that's how many people in Bozeman like beer. It's a biased sample. So when you're picking only the trees that have scars, you're missing all the trees that never did burn. And the other thing that they tend to do, this has gotten better in recent years, but composite scars tend to reduce the years. They add all the years, every year that they can identify that has been a fire, and it might only be one tree that was hit by lightning. And yet they throw that in the composite mix, and then that, of course, shortens the fire interval. I just want to make you aware of, there's a lot more I could talk about that, but there are other ways for reconstructing fire history, and they have different results usually. And that includes air photo interpretation, charcoal studies where they study the amount of sediment, charcoal in rivers and lakes, pollen studies. In other words, if there's a major fire, you're going to have different plants there, so you can study the pollen and you can say, there was a big fire here. Government land reports, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but it's an interesting method. And then sediment studies even, because they can show after a fire, of course, sediment increases for a few years. And so that's in the soil samples, and you can tell, oh yeah, well here in 1850, there was a whole bunch of sediment layers, and that was a big fire then. Anyway, a study, for example, of a high severity fire, central finding of high severity fire recently is that it is not exceeding its historical rates. We hear this all the time. And that in fact, high severity fires were always happening. And just a paper that just came out 2 days ago, the conclusion of that is there's a deficit of high severity fires today. And well, here I have it right there. Anyway, the fire rotation for high severity fires now is 477 years, and it used to be 255 years. Basically, high severity fires would have to increase 1.9 times to equal historic events. And, you know, we know this from things that have happened in the past, like the 1910 big burn in western Montana and northern Idaho burned 3 to 3.5 million acres in 2 days. There's not been a fire since then that anywhere comes close to that. The recent ones in Texas were like 1.2 million acres or something. So the point being, you know, if you go back, it really makes a difference on how you interpret these things is what your temporal and spatial scale is. So if you look at the last 50 years, you come to one conclusion. If you look back 1,000 years, you might find that, you know, high severity fires were actually quite common. The other thing we have is what I call a shifting baseline. So proponents of logging say fires are worse now than the 1970s, which they attribute to fire suppression and fuel accumulation. However, they picked 1970 because that was the low point for fire acreage burned. So yeah, we are having more acres burned since 1970. However, if you look back over a longer period of time, as I suggested, you'll see that this chart starts in 1900 or so and goes through to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the blue part there. And then in the 1980s, we start getting more and more fires. And this has a lot to do with the offshore currents that changed the climate. So that if you start in 1970, yeah, there is a lot more fire. But if you were starting, say, in the 1950s, you'd say there's considerably less. So that makes a difference. For example, in the 1970s, when I was first starting school, I remember my professors talking about the new ice age that was starting and the worry that glaciers were going to come out of Canada and bury Montana again. And so, and that didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is because of our putting too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and we started getting warming. But there were glaciers growing in all the Pacific Northwest peaks during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And why was that? Because it was wetter and cooler then. And when you have wetter and cooler temperatures, there's two things that happen. One, you don't get as many ignitions. And even if you do get an ignition, they don't spread much, so you don't get much acreage burning. And a further thing, in fact, is that you also get better seedling survival, so you get denser forests. So this is a longer scale thing, and I just wanted to point out a couple of interesting points. You can see it says 936. That was a particularly warm period of time. That's when Greenland was settled by the Vikings. And it was greener then because it was warmer. And then we have 1150. What happened in 1150? Well, that's when the Anasazi people in Utah and Arizona left for the Rio Grande because of an extensive drought for a long period of time. And then we go fast forward and we've got the 1613. That was the summer that was called the summer where it was never summer. People starved all over Europe and even in the American it was hard even for people living here in Indian tribes because it was so cold, nothing grew that summer. And so it was cold and wet all through that time, all the way through the 1800s. And that's another interesting thing. I'm real interested in bison. And there's some that speculate that the highest bison herds in more recent times occurred because it was the Little Ice Age and there was more grass and productivity on the Great Plains at that time. So bison herds could be bigger than ever, before that time. Anyway, as you can see, that changes. And so the medieval warm spell, it was caused the Pueblo Indians to abandon their dwellings. And there were also extensive fires up and down the Sierra Nevada, and other parts of the West documented. If fuels drove large wildfires, we'd have the largest fires in places like the Oregon Coast Range because it's wet. There's tons of biomass there, right? Fuel. That's what it is. It's fuel. But why don't you have big fires there? Because it's wet and cool. So that dominated a lot of the West during that whole Little Ice Age, etc. So another point that's really key is most fires remain small. So in Yellowstone, they did a little experiment starting in 1972 to 1987. They did not put out or suppress any backcountry fires. And there were 235 fires in the backcountry. 222 burned less than 5 acres, most of them about an acre. And only one burned more than 1,000 acres. And they all went out without suppression. So, of course, the way we don't usually let fires just burn. See, so we take credit for doing all this fire suppression, most of which is probably unnecessary in most cases because fires will go out on their own. Here's some statistics. A total of 56,320 fires burned over 9 million acres in the Rocky Mountains between 1980 and 2003. 98% of these fires, 55,220, accounted for only 4% of the area burned. In other words, this idea that most fires just burn a couple acres. They don't amount to anything. And then we get to the very small number of fires that do amount to something. And only 2% of all fires accounted for 96% of the acreage charred or burned. And of that, 50 fires, or 0.1%, were responsible for half of the acreage charged. And we know about all these fires because we hear about them every summer. They're the big fires that are in the news, you know, that you constantly hear about, like the Dixie Fire that burned in 2021 in California, burned almost 1 million acres. You know, big fires that have happened here, the Derby Fire over by Big Timber, and so forth. These are fires that we hear about because they're in this little 0.1% of fires. Okay, what happened here? Okay. There we go. Okay, so why is this important? I make this analogy with earthquakes in California. There are 10,000 earthquakes on average in Southern California, and most of them are so small you won't even feel them. And only about 15 or 20 are greater than magnitude 4. So you don't have to build your buildings to survive most of the earthquakes in California because they're not important. It's only the ones that are really big that are important. It's the same thing with wildfire. Most of wildfires are not big. So climate weather, not fuels, drives the large fires, and that's why fuel treatments are largely ineffective. And I'll give you some examples. And the thing to remember is you can have lots and lots of fuel like the Oregon coast, but fuel alone won't get a fire. It's like driving a car. You put in gasoline in the car, and you can have a car full of gasoline, and if you don't turn the ignition, it doesn't go anyplace. And if you don't shift the gears, it doesn't go anyplace. And so you have to have all those things come together at the same time to get the car to burn. I mean, to the car to move. And when I was a kid learning how to drive a car, I had to learn on a stick shift, and I was always stalling out because I couldn't get coordinated for all that kind of stuff at the same time. But eventually I learned. And this is the same thing with fire. And the biggest thing with all big fires is wind. A recent study found that 90% of the acreage burned occurred during periods of strong wind. So if you're going to have one factor, if you don't have any, you could have lots of fuel, you can have an ignition start, you can even have a big drought, and it probably isn't going to do anything unless you have wind. And wind is the key. And the reason is because wind blows embers, and the embers will go sometimes miles ahead of the fire front. And that is why things like thinning the forests, prescribed burns, and all this other stuff that's recommended that's going to save us from fires don't work, because the wind will blow the embers over, around, and through those kinds of things. So if you have wind during periods of drought and aridity and so forth, you will get a fire that will be hard to stop. And the other thing about wind is it's not linear, it's exponential. So that a 20-mile-an-hour wind will spread embers much faster and farther than a 15-mile-an-hour wind. So you can imagine when you hear about these fires down in Southern California with Santa Ana winds that are blowing 100 miles an hour, that's why they don't get stopped, because the embers are getting blown so far ahead. And what you get is you see this wind-driven pattern. This is Yellowstone Lake in the background. This is the 88 fires. And you can see what's called spotting, where there's these black spots, I guess, let me see. Well, it's not working here. There, little spots ahead that where the wind blew embers and it started the fires beyond. And that's why firefighters under these conditions never try to do a frontal assault. They stay on the sides and try to guide a fire, because you could have a fire start behind you and have a fire in front of you, and that's how you get trapped. The other thing, this is I know a hard graph to see. I just want you to point to, look at the green line and then the red lines. Those are the two most important things. That green line there shows what the wind was blowing at 40 plus miles an hour when this fire started. And then the humidity, which is the red line, way down here, was 5%. And then that fire raced ahead. Oh, do that. The fire raced ahead, and then the humidity went up, which is the red line, and what happened is it rained, and the fire went out. So, but they took credit for it. I got this from a Forest Service guy, and he said when the rain started is when they put up the Air Force to go out and put the fire out for the air show. So people thought something was happening. But anyway, this was this same fire, and it's an infrared picture. The red is places that were not treated or thinned, and all the green is places that were thinned, and the black lines show the thinning that was done. And as you can see from this picture, the places that were thinned were the ones that burned at high severity, and the places that didn't have any thinning actually were less likely to burn. And this has been shown by a lot of research, and I'll explain in a little bit why that might be. And here's another picture. This is over by Helena, and this area was thinned 6 months before I took this picture. And one of the ways you can see how there were all these stumps out there, and one of the ways you can tell whether a thing has been burned or thinned before or salvage logged afterwards, the tops of all these stumps are black, indicating that the fire came through after it had been logged. Okay, so look at this is a savanna. I mean, most thinning doesn't even get this thin, and yet it didn't stop it because there was a wind blowing. So another thing that this goes to is that high severity fires on private lands are often greater than on public lands because they have the most active forest management, as they call it. And this is a really cool series I'm going to show you. Okay, this is the Holiday Farm Fire that happened in 2000, I think it's 2020 or 21, anyway, in Oregon. And you will look in the right lower part of the picture right here, and you can see that blue. That's a reservoir. Keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is this up here, which is green. So the red means it burned at high severity, the yellow at mixed severity, and green, of course, hardly burned at all. All right, now, this is the land it burned through. And there you can see the reservoir right there. And you can see the green patch that was up here, no logging. And then this is like, if there's a fuel reduction, it doesn't get much more than that. And yet it had nothing, it just couldn't stop the fire. And there's a reason why that this is a common situation. And that is because as you log it and thin it, remember the factors that contribute to a fire are wind. Well, you open up the forest and make it easier for wind to penetrate. And it also tends to dry out the soil and increase the vapor deficit. So this is interesting. I took this picture. It's right outside of Chester, California. It had just been thinned, the picture on the left. And then I just happened to go back there that following fall after the Dixie fire. And here's as best I could figure is the exact same location that had been thinned that previous April or May. And this map shows you all the orange on here is areas that were actively logged where that Dixie fire burned through. And then this down here is a wilderness area, that green. But where I took the pictures, here's Chester, was right about here on that road. So those that you can see it didn't really do much for stopping that Dixie fire. 900,000 acres plus burned in that fire. And it was mostly land that was under, quote, active forest management. Another one, this is the Thomas fire near Santa Barbara I went to, and this was really interesting. The fire burned all the way down to the ocean. So that was a fire break that was big enough to stop the fire. But there aren't too many that like that. And the fire stopped right at the, you can kind of see the burned shrubs there and so forth. Here's another one. This is the Eagle Fire on the Columbia Gorge, and it jumped the fire break known as the Columbia River. I mean, it was 1.5 miles wide there, no fuel, didn't stop the fire. So you're going up there and you're thinning the forest, you're still leaving some fuel there. And if you think that's going to stop a fire, you got to go look at more of these kinds of fires. So majority of acreage burns under extreme conditions. This is natural, not an aberration. Under extreme conditions, suppression efforts are largely ineffective. Now, I'm going to read you a couple of things because I know this is hard to believe. So I got to show you I'm not cherry picking 1 or 2 studies. There's lots of studies out here that say the same thing. Extreme environmental conditions overwhelmed most fuel treatment effects, included all treatments, including prescribed burning and thinning. Fuel treatments cannot realistically be expected to eliminate large areas burned in severe fire weather. This is a Fish Creek fire that was near Missoula, and it was previously logged and thinned, as you can see, didn't do any good. Congressional Research Service looked at this. They're supposed to be non-biased. From a quantitative view, the CRS study indicates a very weak relationship between acres logged and the extent of severity of forest fires. In fact, our data indicates that fewer acres burned in areas where logging was limited. Okay. Okay, one more study. We investigated the relationship between protected status and fire severity. 1,500 fires. This is a great review. It's not just one, where you can pick out any kind of thing you want to cherry pick about it. We found that forests with higher levels of protection, like wilderness areas and parks where you can't log, had lower severity values, even though they have higher levels of biomass and fuel loading. Again, this is contrary to what we're being told. All right, now, one of the new excuses that have come up, and I'm going to dwell on this a little bit because I hear this all the time now is the reason for doing active management. They said, well, Indians manage the land and they obviously kept fuels low. Well, it turns out that that's not true either. They did keep fuels low, localized around their villages and so forth, but not at a landscape scale. So, for example, this is a study that was done in the Willamette Valley, Oregon, which had very high numbers of population of Native Americans, because of the salmon and mild climate and so forth. So if any place was going to be affected by Indian burning, you'd expect it to be there. And what they found was that Native Americans burn from the idea that Native Americans burn from one end of the valley to the other is not supported by our data. Most fires seem to have been fairly localized and track large-scale climate change. Here's another study in Yosemite. Yosemite Valley had Indian villages there, but they said our records indicate that climate change influenced burning at all spatial scales. Native American influence appeared to be limited to local scales. Here's one just in Jackson Hole, south of us. I won't read you the whole part, but it says Native Americans apparently did not alter the vegetation and fire regimes significantly during the occupation of Jackson Hole. And I could give you more of that, but to show you this is all across the country. This is a study done in New England, and they said the highest Native American populations in the last 14,000 years, there's no pollen or charcoal evidence for regionally extensive human impacts or open land vegetation. Subsistence practices, including hunting, fish gathering, and small-scale farming, apparently resulted in local ecological impacts without transforming the broader forested landscape. And we have evolutionary evidence too. For example, sagebrush, which is a low elevation and grow up high, but a lot of the West, low elevation, you'll find sagebrush, has no adaptation to fire. So if tribal people were burning fire all over the place, especially at low elevations, we wouldn't have sagebrush. We wouldn't have sage grouse. We wouldn't have sage stasters. We wouldn't have pygmy rabbits. The same for chaparral, which does burn at high severity, but at longer periods of time, not frequently. And chaparral disappears if you burn it too much. So we have two of the major plant communities. Chaparral is the most common plant community in California. We have some of the most common plant communities that exist, and they would not exist if they were burning every 5 or 10 years. And so the idea that fuel reductions like prescribed burns may influence they can be influenced under low to moderate fire weather, but it has so little of the landscape that's done, it's unimportant. It's like using a watering can and calling it a river. In other words, that's the other thing. The Deschutes National Forest around Bend burns about 2,000 to 3,000 acres a year, and it's 1.8 million acre forest or whatever it might be. That's just nothing on the landscape. It just isn't going to make a difference. And the plants grow back. So in 5 to 10 years, you have as much biomass as you had before. And in fact, a lot of times it's more burnable stuff because it's fine fuels. So another thing that's interesting is green trees burn better than dead trees. That's another, you always hear, oh, well, the trees died from pine beetles or something like that. We got to go and log it because we're going to have a fire. Well, actually green trees, because they have all these resins in them and they have lots of needles and fine fuel, are the things that burn. The trees don't burn. It's all the needles and stuff on it. That's why you get snags afterwards. And that's what they're important for, critical for ecosystem health and carbon storage. So I love this cartoon. This is Gary Larson. And it says, and you see this ring right here, Jimmy? That's another time when the old fella miraculously survived some big forest fire. And the point being is that we need to actively manage the forest, which usually means we're going to log it. And then we're going to kill the trees to save the forest with chainsaw medicine, because of course the forests are unhealthy. And so but the problem with that is logging is not benign either. You have thinning reduces future snags and down wood. Most thinning requires logging roads, which increases sedimentation in streams and erosion. Logging roads spread weeds. Logging disrupts wildlife. The probability that any fire will encounter a treated area is low. About 1% is what some estimates are. So you do all this damage and you don't necessarily get any benefit from it, but you get the damage now. So this is a sanitized, simplified forest. This is chainsaw medicine on the Deschutes National Forest near Bend. And they did this in the name of forest health. Well, look at it. There's no snags on the dead wood on the ground. There's no snags. There's no vegetation. There's no grass and no shrubs. And the trees are pretty much all about the same size. And that represents, in my view, an unhealthy forest ecosystem. And the other thing that's important to remember too is half the acreage burn occurs in non-forested areas. So, for example, the fire that was just burning in Texas, over 1 million acres, that was all grassland fire. And a lot of over half the acreage burned in California is in chaparral and grasslands and so forth. So even if this stuff did work, it would not stop all large fires. We'd still have a lot of acreage burning. Another thing to keep in mind is that 84% of the fires start in the last 2 decades are attributed to human causes. And nearly all human ignitions are within 300 feet of a road. So we're out there thinning the forest, and we got to put in roads to do it. And we're making more roads where there's more likely to be a fire along it that will start and maybe at an inappropriate time. The other thing is carbon storage, which is increasingly important because carbon is in the atmosphere is what's causing climate warming. So in Oregon, which admittedly has more logging than you'd find, say, in Montana or Wyoming or something, but forest fires only accounted for 4% of the total carbon emissions. Logging accounted for 35%. Even transportation was only 23%. And so the green there is the area affected by wood products industry. And people always ask, how do you get carbon release? Well, when you cut the trees down, you leave a lot of fine stuff on the ground that rots, that releases carbon. When you have waste at the mill, that's more carbon. It gets burned up, or it just rots quicker, and so forth. So that's how they get that larger number. And fuel reductions are ineffective and inefficient. This is from Jack Cohen, who worked at the Missoula Fire Labs for many years. He says the way to deal with this stuff is not to do extensive wildlands fuel reductions, but reduce the flammability of land, private lands. So here's an example. This is a picture from Waldo Canyon Fire in Colorado. And you can see there's green trees all around these foundations that burned, and there's pavement all around. So the fire did not burn into the houses. It was embers getting blown by high winds that landed on the house. And then this is what happens. House fires put out way more energy and heat than a forest fire. So a forest fire, even a wind-driven one, comes through, it's a heat pulse, and then it goes on. And if you don't have anything that will ignite during that heat pulse, you're not going to have a burned down house. But if you have something that catches fire, you'll burn down the house and maybe your neighbor's house. So this is Paradise, California, which a couple of years ago burned 19,000 homes and killed 87 people. And note the green trees all around those foundations. It's just incredible. You go there and you say, what happened? Well, this fire with wind was blowing. The fire spread was 1 football field a second. Now, even the fastest of the football players out there can't run about maybe 100 yards in 10 seconds or something. So that gives you an idea. That fire was moving, and that was part of the reason why people got killed. And I used to say in my previous shows that I used to give on this, I used to say, the only thing that'll save your place from burning is a big parking lot, like around the Walmart. And then I went to Paradise and I saw the Safeway burn down, even with a parking lot all around it. It's like, how could this be? Well, embers got on the building and burned the Safeway to the ground. And this is what it looks like around Paradise. These little squares are clear cuts. So you had fuel reductions all around that. On top of that, you had a couple of fires previously, and still the town burned down because of that fire spread. So we have this problem. I call it sprawling into disaster. Maybe it's not my idea. I think that was Dennis Glick's idea from over in Livingston. But anyway, sprawling into disaster. We're building roads in all of these places, and it's hard to get. First of all, it's much more likely you'll have an ignition then, because like, for example, one of the ways you get fires today is power lines. A tree falls on a power line. Well, the more houses you have spread out, the more power lines you have out there. Another thing is, of course, the roads. You have more roads, you have more likely somebody who's going to start a fire with throwing a cigarette out, or just by happenstance, like the car fire, which burned in Northern California near Redding, started because some guy got a flat tire in his trailer and he pulled over the side of the road, and the metal from the tire sparked and started a fire that burned, like 300,000 acres or something like that. So the more roads you have, the more chance of fires you're going to have. And that's why we need, and this is a picture on the right, it shows Yellowstone. You can see Yellowstone Lake there and some of the wilderness areas like the Wind River Range to the south and the Tetons. And then the rest is all the roads around us here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. More wilderness will reduce fires. We need more wilderness and parks. And so that's one of the themes that we're trying to promote. And land use zoning. Oregon has statewide zoning. People don't believe this, but you have urban growth boundaries. Even a little town like this has an urban growth boundary, and you are not allowed to build outside of it. And it was originally set up to protect agricultural lands, but it also has the effect that you don't get the sprawl like you would around here. And look at these, you can see the lines right there. That's a little town. It's about 20 miles from Eugene, where the most people live in the whole state of Oregon, the Willamette Valley. And you go down the Willamette Valley, especially at night, it's like you go from lights in Portland, and then it gets dark. And then you hit Salem, and there's lights, and then it gets dark again. And then you go a little further, and then you hit Eugene, there's more lights. But there's not much lights in between because of this law, which was enacted in 1972. So treat homes, not forests. Again, there's the treatment of fuels immediately proximity to residents and the degree which residential structures can ignite that determine if the residentials are votable. And this was the Waldo Canyon fire again in Colorado. And you can see how this house burned down, but there's other houses there that didn't. I don't know why they didn't burn down or why this one did, because I go visit these fires after they occur. But it's obvious that not every house is vulnerable. So here's one. This house is going to burn down someday. You can see there's nice pine needles all over the roof there. It's got trees leaning down over the house. It's got shrubs right, it got shrubs right to it. And, but Jack Cohen has found that wooden walls won't ignite at more than 130 feet away. So you don't have to do any thinning or any of this other stuff more than 130 feet from a house. So going 2 miles or 20 miles from a town and say you're going to save the houses by logging, well, you're not doing that. And even intense fire flames won't set a wall on fire from 30 feet away or more. And so what can you do? You can treat your house, clean gutters, get rid of roof debris, put metal or non-flammable roof, put screens on vents, remove flammable materials like wood piles next to house, put a sprinkler in the room. I bought a sprinkler for my house. It cost me $49. You hook up a hose, and the last thing I'm going to do if I have to when I'm leaving town is I turn on the water. And probably my house will survive because can't guarantee it, but it's cheap, try out and see if it does work, right? So you got to think outside the box. There was a fire down in LA, and they attributed half the houses burning down to doggy doors. Now think about it. Your doggy door is made to swing in and out in the wind. And when do you have intense fires? When there's a lot of wind. And so the embers were getting blown into these houses on the doggy doors. Nobody thinks about that, right? Another fire up the Shields Valley here. I visited this place that burned to the ground, and they had these hanging plants like that. And they had, the little ferny-like stuff in there. And what happened was the fire got in there, and they were hanging by rope. And the ropes burned through, and the fire fell down on the wooden deck, and that started the deck on fire, and then the house burned down. So sometimes you got to think about what could be doing. So here's my concluding remarks. This is where I tell you what I told you at the beginning, again, to remind you. First, we got to reduce greenhouse gases, carbon in the atmosphere. Climate warming is exacerbating fire spread and size. Climate and weather drive large wildfires. Fuel reductions have limited value under extreme fire conditions. Worse, they're expensive and delusional. the probability that any large blaze will encounter a future treatment is very low. Wildfires and natural events like bark beetles improve and invigorate ecosystems. They create healthy ecosystems. And by the way, another problem with thinning is you don't know which trees have a genetic resistance to bark beetles or drought or even fire. And so they go and they take, say, 50% of the trees out. You may be removing the one tree in that group that might be resistant. And we know that these exist, these differences in resistance to different disturbance factors like drought or insects or whatever. So that's one of the other ways that they actually, they say they're doing it for forest health, but they're making the forest more unhealthy and less resistant. And finally, severe wildfires provide the bulk of dead tree recruitment in forest ecosystems. If we didn't have big wildfires, we wouldn't have a lot of dead trees, and we wouldn't have nearly as many birds, bees, frogs, fishes, the whole 9 yards that depend on those things. And the way to protect communities is to reduce the home flammability and zoning to prevent building in the fire plane. And I always end with this: we need fires to create habitat for forest elves. And these are my kids. A couple of summers, I went traveling around looking at fires and taking pictures for the book. And after the summer, I got home, and my daughter, who, I don't know, was probably 7 or 8 at the time, was talking to a couple of friends. And they said, "What'd you do for summer vacation?" Oh, one friend says, "Oh, I went to camp and I learned how to canoe." And another one says, "Oh, I went to the coast and I was with my grandparents and we were by the ocean." "So what'd you do summer?" And she said, "Well, I went around with my dad all summer looking at burnt forests." So that was her reaction. All right. Well, thank you very much. That's my talk, and I'll answer any questions you have.
Okay. Hello? Yeah, it's on. Okay. So if you have a question in the audience, just raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you. And also, okay, here we go.
So it seems like there's a huge disconnect between all this great science and how the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, is managing, and the Montana Forest Service's state management is trying to reduce fires. So where do we start?
Well, let me say 2 things. One, the Forest Service can find studies that suggest what they are doing works, but you have got to look at that stuff very closely. For example, I just read an article 2 weeks ago saying that fuel treatments were efficient and worked. And I read through the article, and they said they accounted for weather, but they didn't account for a separate category, extreme fire weather. In other words, they would say, well, fuel treatments seem to work under various weather conditions. Well, I'll agree with that, but not under extreme fire weather conditions. So that's the first thing. They have science. And if you're working for the agencies, you'll find that most of the science is being done by scientists who are funded by the agency or work for the agency at the Fire Research Center in Missoula, or they're working, at a university and they're getting funding for their study from the Forest Service, et cetera. And as I suggested, that tends to influence the kind of questions you ask. Now, it doesn't mean that most scientists are pretty honest. They don't try to, cook the books or anything like that. But again, the questions you ask, I have at the very beginning of this talk, one of the pictures that didn't come up because of the little confusion at the beginning. But about 100 years ago, it was very common to measure skull size. And what they found, it was based on the assumption that the size of your skull dictated your intelligence. And men just so happens to have bigger skulls. So, but the trouble with that kind of study wasn't that they were measuring wrong. It's true. It's just that the skull size has nothing to do with intelligence. So there's that kind of thing where you can ask the kind of questions. And then the other thing is the bureaucracy. All these bureaucracies want to survive. That's part of, if you're a bureaucracy, you want to keep going. And what happened was that in the 1980s and so forth, you heard about the forest wars in Oregon and the Northwest Forest Plan to save the spotted owl and all this stuff. Well, the cutting on national forests went way down. And so if you were at a district office ranger station, it was really tough times, because how do you justify all the guys you got there that are timber guys and the associated money to run those things? And so they got money from timber sales that would pay for their trucks and all this stuff. So they had to come up with a new excuse for logging, and it conveniently, fire became the excuse. And now that's the biggest part of the Forest Service budget now, is fighting fires or treating the land to prevent fires. And there's really nothing that I think can be done about that, except to maybe come up with some other reason for the Forest Service to exist. And they will reinvent themselves if this stuff eventually falls out of favor. The problem is people are misled all the time. I'll give you one example. There was a fire near Sisters, Oregon, and all over Oregon, it's well publicized. It's called the Millie Fire. And what happened was the fire got to a place where there was a fuel treatment, and they thinned the forest, and it stopped there. And so they said, well, look at thinning, stop the fire. But I read the fire incident report on that fire, and it turned out at the exact time, the wind shifted direction 180 degrees and blew the fire back up onto lava fields. That's what saved Sisters, not the thinning. And so, some of those kinds of nuances are ignored. I know I'm going on, but I'll give one other example. There's a paper by some range guys down at the University of Arizona saying the same thing. Grazing will save us from fires, And at the very next to last paragraph, it says, however, our research suggests that this only works at low to fire conditions, extreme fire conditions doesn't work. Well, you had to get all the way to the end of the paper to find that one paragraph, and it was advertised all over the West. If we only grazed more, we wouldn't have wildfires. So I'm just saying, you kind of have to know what to look for in the science, and there's science that can justify anything. And then I guess it depends on who you believe. So.
Okay, next.
Yeah, would you recommend, in essence, partially defunding the Forest Service and turning over the management of those lands to people like Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, to get away from the industrial logging guys?
Well, I'm a big advocate of national parks for partly that reason. The Park Service's whole way of operating, and to a lesser degree, Fish and Wildlife Service, but is still to basically put natural processes, ecological processes first. And that's another interesting thing. You find that, national parks, in a lot of cases, of course, have no logging or very limited. They might do it around a few buildings, that kind of thing. There's been a little logging in Yosemite Valley, for example. But as a rule, the motto is hands off. And one of the big fires that burned in California a couple of years ago, I think it was called the Rim Fire, I went to, and it burned really high severity, and it got to the Yosemite border, and it basically fizzled out. And so the area was under national forests, had been logged extensively, and that's when the fire raced along, and then it got to denser forests. I don't think I mentioned this, but denser forests, the wind doesn't penetrate as much, and they often have cooler temperatures, and you also have more moisture. So all those sometimes can actually reduce the amount of fires. A lot of fires, I go around and look at them, but you'll see on north-facing slopes, most of you probably have noticed this, north-facing slopes have more trees, south-facing slopes will often be grasslands or thin leaf cover with trees. And you'll often find the north slopes have less severe fire. And that's because it's cooler and denser. So I'm sort of long-winded saying, yes, I think that would be great if we could have more parks and wilderness and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any questions online yet? No? Okay, you people online joining us, get your questions in now if you have any burning questions for George. Any other questions here? Yep, okay, hold on. Okay, here you go.
Thanks for your talk. It was very informative. Are there maps for fire plains available for zoning purposes?
Oh, yeah. They're doing this in parts of California and Oregon. In fact, they did it in Oregon, and it got people so angry that they took them down because if I were somebody who had a house in a fire plain, I would too, because it affects your insurance. as some of you may have heard, in California, insurance companies are now pulling out of parts of California and won't insure your house if you're in certain locations that are fire prone. And you can imagine what that does. You can't sell your house if you can't get it insured unless somebody's got cash. You won't be able to get a mortgage. So yes, they do exist, but they're kind of looked down upon by a lot of politicians and realtors and everybody else. So.
Okay, thanks. We do have an online question. Rich, can you read it to George, please?
Yeah, can you give some clarification about what are the recommendations regarding trees and bushes near your house?
Yeah, regarding trees and bushes near the house is, if you can eliminate, this is another study in California, they said if you would have a 5-foot wide area with no vegetation, like gravel or sidewalk or whatever, no fuel, that increased the chances of your house surviving a fire by like 75% or something like that. And the same with a metal roof is another thing. If you have a metal roof, that makes a huge difference in your likelihood that it will burn down. So there are very simple and cost-effective ways to protect your home if you're inclined to do that. And then, you know, it's a good idea to trim tree. You don't have to cut all the trees around your house or anything like that, but not a good idea to have branches hanging right over the house and that sort of thing. And so that's one way to do it. And, you know, one thing I wanted to get back to circle back to my beginning is to say how, you know, these big fires are like a gift. You know, it's the gift of the snack forest. It's the way that it affects evolution and so forth. We have to change our whole way of looking at fires instead of just automatically saying it's a bad. If your house burns up, that's not great. I'll admit that to anybody. But your house doesn't have to burn up if you take the right precautions for the most part. And just seeing dead trees in the woods isn't necessarily a bad thing from the point of view of life out there that depends on all those snags and trees.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and I was one hand up here, so here we go.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk also. You just mentioned the importance of metal roofs
Yeah.
as a possibility for protecting your home.
Yep.
What do you think about the asphalt shingles that say they have the same fire protection ability?
They're pretty good too. I mean, metal is a little better, but the point is you don't want to have a kind of a roof that's easily ignited. So, you know, I know it depends on the shingles that you buy and so forth, how well they will resist that. But covering your vents that go into attics so you don't have embers blown in there. If you have windows, try to have double at least, if not triple pane windows, because otherwise sometimes the heat will cause the windows to crack and stuff blows in. So just go, you know, you can find the stuff online about what to do to make your house safe. But one more point I want to make about it is if you do it on your house, good for you. But if the rest of your neighbors don't do it and their houses catch on fire, houses put out way more heat than a forest fire. So if you're living in a neighborhood like I do, where I got like 10 feet between my house and the next house, if the neighbor's house goes on fire, there's a good chance my house is going to burn down, even though I've done all these things to prevent fire from getting into the house right in next to the house. So community standards are real important. Up in Canada, in Canmore, which is a town right next to Banff National Park, they have very stringent restrictions there on house building materials as well as what you have to do. So they come around the city, you know, of course it's Canada and they're more tolerant of government telling you what to do. But anyway, they come around and they say, hey, you can't have that firewood against your house. We'll give you a month to remove it or you get fined. Or they do prescribe burning and thinning right near the edge of the community. But like the research suggests, more than 130, 150 feet doesn't give you buy you anything more. But they do it every year right close to the town. And it has helped. There've been 2 major fires that have come through there and town survived. So, you know, it's not perfect, but the best thing, of course, is not to build in the forest if you can avoid it. But everybody likes that, and so we see that. So anyway, that's why land use planning is a good thing, and zoning.
Thank you so much, George. I think we've run out of time now,
Yeah.
but it was extremely interesting. Maybe we can give him a round of applause because it was Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. I just have a little wrap up here. Can extend this. Whoops. Oh, I went too far. Well, never mind. I have a lot of slides to get through. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you all for coming. And I just wanted to, once again, share with you that tomorrow is a big day to celebrate Earth Day. If you want to come out to the county fairgrounds, we have things starting at 9 o'clock. There is a fun run race you can sign up for at 8 a.m. that raises money for the Gallatin Watershed Council. If you want to support clean water in our community, they do great work. Also, they create great habitat for trout. And then also that Saturday, we have the Earth Day Festival. Ah, there we go. There's the Earth Day Run. And you can sign up for that before midnight tonight, I believe, at winddrinkers.org. And then the Earth Day Festival, we have talks every hour. You can go on our website at GallatinValleyEarthDay.org to see the listing of the talks. We have live music, we have food, we have 50 different exhibits, all very, very interesting. And we also have a lot of great children events, a free magic monster show, face painting, petting zoo, educational, interactive educational games for kids. They all win prizes, so it's very fun. So hope to see you out tomorrow at the fairgrounds. And thank you for coming. And thank you, George.
And thank
Good
you, everybody, for coming too. Appreciate it.